Not being unclear about cause and effect. Not falling subject to cause and effect. According to Buddhism, deluded people casually make mistakes for not knowing the seriousness of cause and effect. They even deny the law of cause and effect. On the contrary, Zen practitioners should have a clear understanding of the law of cause and effect, so they dare not make mistakes in cause and effect. They always consider carefully before doing anything. The sage cultivate in order to understand the process of cause and effect. Ordinary people continue to create causes and undergo effects. From no offenses they intentionally commit offenses. Once they have committed offenses, they refuse to acknowledge them as offenses, insisting that they have done nothing wrong. They have no shame nor repentance for their offenses. Not being unclear about cause and effect. Not falling subject to cause and effect. Patriarch Paichang Huaihai, an awakened Zen practitioner, was on a throne speaking the Dharma. After the Dharma session ended, everyone departed except for an elderly man with white hair and beard. Seeing this, Patriarch Paichang asked why. So the elderly man recounted the following story. Dear Patriarch, originally, in the past, I was a Buddhist monk cultivating in this mountain. At that time, I was on the throne teaching the Dharma, and a young student studying the Buddha Dharma asked me, "For those who cultivate Mahayana Buddhism, do they remain a part of the law of cause and effect?" I replied, "Outside of the law of cause and effect," because my answer was unclear in that way. The Dharma listener misinterpreted it as, "There is no cause and effect." Although I was a Dharma master who taught the Mahayana Dharma Sutra teachings, yet I answered in such an ambiguous manner, causing the listener to misinterpret my answer. Therefore, I was not able to achieve any spiritual fulfillment. In contrast, I was condemned to be a paranormal fox, and I have lived in this mountain for the past 500 reincarnations. Today I ask the Great Master to have compassion, to help me change that mistake, and help me escape this suffering existence of being an animal. Paichang said to the old man, "If that is the case, at this time, you should use the same words of that student and ask me." The old man knelt down, put his palms together and asked respectfully, "For those who cultivate Mahayana Buddhism, do they remain as part of the law of cause and effect?" The Patriarch replied, "Do not doubt the law of cause and effect," meaning those who cultivate Mahayana Buddhism should never doubt the law of cause and effect. They must know the theory of cause and effect is inherent clear and inseparable like a shadow is to a body. As soon as the Patriarch finished, the elderly man was awakened suddenly. He prostrated respectfully and said, "I have been condemned as a fox for over 500 reincarnations. But today, relying on just one line of your teaching, I will be able to find liberation. I will now abandon my body as a fox in my den at the base of the mountain, behind this temple. I ask the Great Master to please make funeral arrangements on my behalf." The next day, Paichang ordered the ringing of bells to gather the community of monks in order to give a funeral service to a monk who had just passed away. This came as a great surprise to the bhikshus in the temple because they had not noticed any monk in the temple who was gravely ill or had died recently. Paichang then led the great following to the cave behind the temple and used his rod to poke into the cave. After a while, they were able to recover a body of a fox with white fur who had died recently. He had everyone chant a sutra for the liberation of the spirit for a period of time before lighting a fire to cremate the body. The ashes were collected and buried. Sincere Buddhists should always remember. With a false saying contrary to the proper Dharma. With a blind teaching without a clear meaning. That former monk was condemned to be an animal for 500 reincarnations. Let alone teaching of wrong teaching. Or wrong views that is not appropriate to the time and level to guide and teach Buddhists. And in the process of harming, delaying and impeding sentient beings cultivated path toward achieving enlightenment. According to the story of Paichang and the fox, not to fall to the karmic retribution is a moral deed, and not to obscure, or without ambiguity, the law of cause and effect is an intellectual attitude. Not to fall to the karmic retribution makes one stand altogether outside the realm of causation, which is the world of particulars, and where we have our being. In the case of without ambiguity in the law of cause and effect, what happens is the shifting of our mental attitude towards a world above cause and effect. And because of this shifting, the whole outlook of life assumes a new tone, which may be called spiritual, not to obscure. Through the story of Paichang and the fox, we see that the question of not falling to karmic retribution and without ambiguity in the law of cause and effect is a big issue, not only for Buddhists of all schools, but also for philosophers and religiously minded people. In other words, it is the question of freedom of the will. It is the question of transcending karma. It is the question of logic and spirit, of science and religion, of nature and supernature, of moral discipline and faith. Indeed, it is the most fundamental of all religious questions. If not falling to karmic retribution, then this will jeopardizes the whole plan of the universe. For cause and effect, or the law of causation that binds existence together. And without the reality of moral responsibility, the very basis of society is pulled down. Buddhists should be careful with the meaning of bad move, although it is the literal meaning of not to be obscured. Here the sense is rather not to negate, or not to ignore, or not to obliterate. Bodhisattva fears of causes. Ordinary people fear of results. Karma reward. The retribution of karma, good or evil. However, according to the Huayan sect, the body of karmic retribution, especially that assumed by a bodhisattva to accord with the conditions of those he seeks to save, the pain or pleasure resulting in this life from the practices or causes and retributions of a previous life. Therefore, ancient virtues said, if we wish to know what our lives were like in the past, just look at the retributions we are experiencing currently in this life. If we wish to know what retributions will happen to us in the future, just look and examine the actions we have created or are creating in this life. If we understand clearly this theory, then in our daily activities, sincere Buddhists are able to avoid unwholesome deeds and practice wholesome deeds. The retribution received in the next or further incarnation for the deeds done in this life. Wholesome and unwholesome karma are created in this life. But sometimes the karma will pass through the second, third life, or even longer before one is able to reap the meritorious retributions or endure the evil consequences. Whether these future retributions are earlier or later is not absolute, but it is absolutely unavoidable. If there is action, whether it is good or evil, there will be consequences sooner or later. Ancient sages taught, the heaven's net may be thin, but even a hair will not fall through, and, supposing hundreds of thousands of lives have passed, but the karma created still remains. When destinies circumstances come to fruition, the appropriate retributions will not be denied. There are some noticeable situations which Buddhists should clearly understand to prevent any misunderstanding about the law of cause and effect. Those who commit evil in this life, yet continue to prosper, it is because they have only began to commit transgressions in this life. However, in the former lives, they have already formed wholesome merits. Make offerings and charitable donations. The evil deeds of this life which have just been planted have not had the proper time to form unwholesome consequences, while the wholesome deeds in the former lives planted long ago have had the time to come to fruition in the present life. There are also other circumstances where people practice good deeds, yet they continue to suffer, experience setbacks, misfortunes. That is because they have just learned to practice wholesome conducts in the present life. Otherwise, in the former lives, they have created many unwholesome deeds. The wholesome deeds in this life have just been planted, have not had the proper time to grow into wholesome fruition. However, the wholesome and wicked deeds in the former lives, which had been planted long, long ago, have had the proper time to come to fruition in the present life. This is one of the three consequences associated with the causes for a child to be born into a certain family: transgressions or wholesome deeds we perform in this life. We will not receive good or bad results in the next life. However, good or bad results can appear in the third, fourth, or 1000th lifetime, or until untold eons in the future. It is not only ordinary people cannot escape cause and effect. Even the Bodhisattvas cannot avoid them. However, Bodhisattvas are enlightening beings who have far-ranging vision. They know bad causes will surely end up in bad results. Thus, Bodhisattvas are afraid of bad consequences in the future. Not only they avoid planting evil causes or evil karma in the present, but they also diligently cultivate to gradually diminish their karmic obstructions, at the same time to accumulate their virtues and merits, and ultimately to attain Buddhahood. However, sentient beings complete constantly to gather evil causes, therefore they must suffer evil effect. When ending the effect of their actions, they are not remorseful or willing to repent. Not only do they blame heaven and other people, but they continue to create more evil karma in opposition and retaliation. Therefore, enemies and vengeance will continue to exist forever in this vicious cycle. Zen practitioners should always remember that by planting more good causes, we will surely reap good consequences in the future. In the contrary, if we only see the present and engage in immoral practices by not planting good roots and accumulating merits and virtues, we will surely bear bad consequences. Without any exception, the raft of the Four Noble Truths. A person who is cultivating mindfulness is similar to a man who is escaping from a group of bandits, come to a vast stretch of water that is in his way. He knows that this side of the shore is dangerous and the other side is safe. However, there is no boat going to the other shore, nor is there any bridge for crossing over. So he quickly gathers wood, branches and leaves to make a raft, and with the help of the raft, he crosses over safely to the other shore. The Noble Eightfold Path taught by the Buddha is like the raft. It would take us from the suffering of this shore to the other shore of no suffering. In Mahayana Buddhism, the teaching is likened a raft. When the goal, the other shore, is reached, then the raft is left behind. The form of teaching is not final dogma, but an expedient method, according to the discourse on the water snake's parable. The Buddha taught, "My teaching is like a raft for crossing over, not for carrying." In Buddhism, Dharma refers to all the methods of cultivation taught by the Buddha which lead to ultimate enlightenment. They are means that lead to an end, not an end themselves. The Buddha's teaching is likened a raft for going the other shore. All of us depend on the raft of Dharma to cross the river of birth and death. We strive with our hands, feet, and wisdom to reach the other shore. When the goal, the other shore, is reached, then the raft is left behind. The form of teaching is not final dogma, but an expedient method, according to the discourse on the water snake's parable. The Buddha taught, "My teaching is like a raft for crossing over, not for carrying." Also according to the middle-length saying, the Buddha taught, "The Dharma that I teach is like a raft. Even Dharma should be relinquished. How much the more that which is not Dharma? The raft of Dharma is for crossing over, not for retaining." In a famous passage in the Majjhima Nikaya of the Pali Canon, the Buddha likens his teaching to a raft. Suppose, he says, a traveler sees a great expanse of water. The shore he stands on is dangerous and frightening, while the opposite shore offers safety, peace, and tranquility. There is neither a bridge to cross, nor a ferry to carry him over. So he built a raft. Once on the other shore, what should he do? Drag the raft that had been useful to him and turn it into an impediment? Or let go of it now that he is safely across the water? The raft, the Buddha observes, is for crossing with, not clinging to. And the same is true of his teaching. It is neither an intellectual endeavor, nor a creed, but merely something to be brought into being and cultivated. The Buddha's teaching is most succinctly expressed in the Four Noble Truths, one of the most universally accepted formulations of Buddhism. These truths proclaim dukkha and its cessation, and reflect the content of the Buddha's enlightenment. According to tradition, he expounded them in his first sermon, delivered to his 5 former companions at the Deer Park near Sarnath. This sermon is called the Setting in Motion of the Wheel of Dharma, and constitutes one of the most basic teaching of Buddhism. The first noble truth is the truth of dukkha. The Buddha said that everything is dukkha: birth, aging, sickness, death, parting, unfulfilled desires, decay, the state of all phenomena constantly changing. Any experience, whether pleasurable or painful, is dukkha. Dukkha is the condition of universal impermanence, which affects everything. Even the I or self has no enduring quality, because in reality it is merely an error arising from false conceptualization. This doctrine of no self is one of 3 characteristics of all conditioned existence, together with dukkha and impermanence. The second noble truth, the truth of the origin of dukkha, explains that dukkha arises from craving, literally thirst, Pali thrishna, craving for sensual pleasure, for having more or for having less, for existence or for self-annihilation. Such craving or greed is part of a cycle that is described as a 12-link chain of dependent origination. It arises from feeling, which in turn arises from sense contact, which arises from the 6 senses, which arise from mind and form, which arise from consciousness, which arises from formations, which arise from ignorance, which arises from suffering, which arises from birth, which arises from becoming, which arises from grasping, which arises from craving, and thus round and round again. One of the most celebrated principles of Buddhism, dependent origination underlies karma, causality, change and free will, and the way in which all conditioned phenomena exist. It is usually described as beginning with ignorance or confusion. The third truth is the noble truth of the cessation of dukkha. This truth asserts that there is an end to dukkha. Supreme and final liberation is the blowing out of the fires of greed, hatred and delusion. That occurs when the cause of dukkha is removed, when dependent origination is fully understood, and its consequences drawn out, when the chain is broken and the craving that leads to endless births and deaths is abandoned. Complete and final cessation of dukkha is achieved. The Buddha called the third noble truth the cessation. This is not identical to nirvana. Nirvana is not an effect produced by a cause. If it were, it would arise dependently. And if it arose dependently, it would not be able to offer a means of escape from the clutches of karma and rebirth. The fourth noble truth, the truth of the Eightfold Noble Path, identifies the factors leading to the cessation of dukkha. These 8 factors affirm the 3 essential elements of Buddhist spiritual training: moral conduct, concentration, and wisdom. The 4 noble truths are commonly explained by use of medical allegory. In the first noble truth, the human condition is diagnosed as being dukkha. The second noble truth cites craving as the cause of this malady. The third noble truth makes a prognosis about the condition, proclaiming that recovery is possible. Finally, the fourth noble truth, the Eightfold Noble Path to the cessation of dukkha, is the medicine prescribed to restore the patient's health. It is also customary to associate some sort of activity with each of the 4 truths. The first truth is to be fully comprehended. The second needs to be eradicated. It requires thirst to be quenched. The third truth is to be realized, to be made into reality. And the fourth is to be cultivated, to be brought into being, that is, to be kept and followed. The entire Buddhist Dharma can be seen as an elaboration of the 4 noble truths.